I would like to welcome you all to this session. My name is Alan Miller. I'm chairman of the Nighttime Industries Association, and we're partnering with the Institute of Ideas at the Battle of Ideas here to do this session, along with SAB Miller, the title of which is The End of Boozy Britain ? And it's interesting in my position at the Nighttime Industry Association that I found going around the country at various pub watches and meetings with different representatives, the police and others. Often I find these days that people seldom mention the word alcohol without using the word harm next to it. And it made a big impression on me. And I think that some of the discussion today will touch on some of that. You'll notice from the introduction that in 2011, Dr. Vivienne Nathanson from the British Medical Association said we have to start denormalising alcohol for health reasons. And I think that certainly some of the discussion around health and policy has impacted across the board in terms of licensing, pubs, bars in the UK, off licences and our drinking patterns more generally. We're very lucky to have a really brilliant, esteemed panel of speakers this evening. So I'm going to quickly get over to them, and I'm not going to do them justice in my introductions to them because each of them have got really remarkable bios. So, do read and see more on them. But in the order in which people are going to be speaking, first is Daisy Blench. Daisy is the Policy Manager and Alcohol Policy and Responsibility at the BBPA, which is the British Beer and Pub Association. Directly next to me is Christopher Snowden, who is the Director of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. He's the author of many publications, one of which is The Art of Suppression, but many things on alcohol trends in the last 10 years and a range of other documents. Then directly next to me is Dr. Clare Gerada, who is a GP and also been a past chair of the Royal College of General Practitioners, MBE, and very esteemed in this arena. On my far right is Neil Davenport, who is a writer, a teacher, and a journalist that writes extensively on a number of issues, lifestyle and politics. And finally, Sian Jarvis, Managing Director of Jarvis and Bow Communications, former Director General of Communications at the Department of Health. So please join me in welcoming the panel. We've got a shorter session today, so I'm going to go straight into asking the speakers to present their case, and then we're going to get over to you guys. So, Daisy, over to you, please.
Thanks very much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be part of this festival, which it seems like a really fascinating event, and hopefully this session today will be good. My name's Daisy, as Alan said, and I'm from the British Beer and Pub Association. And the BBPA is the main trade body for brewers and pub companies in the UK. And our members brew about 90% of beer brewed in the UK and own around half of the UK's pubs. The information that we had given to us today about this debate asked, is the decline of drinking really something to be celebrated? And in my view, if we're talking about overall consumption, then I would say no. I think, take the sector I work in, beer and pubs are a massively important part of our country, quite frankly, and an important part of people's lives and of local communities and of the economy. And I think they're something pretty unique for the UK, which we should be massively proud of and which we should cherish. Many from abroad choose to visit them, to have a pint of our fantastic British beer and to visit our wonderful pubs. And I think that's a brilliant thing. It seems like a cliche to say sometimes, but also many life events happen in pubs. People love to go there and people meet partners there. They celebrate weddings, birthdays, all kinds of events. And just as well as just meeting friends after work or for dinner. And in my view, Alan mentioned the phrase trying to denormalise alcohol. And I think that's a really sad state of affairs if that's where we need to get to in our society today. I don't think we should be trying to denormalise something which can be a perfectly normal part of people's lives, which people can enjoy sensibly. And for me, this seems like a bit of a move that we sometimes get to try and get rid of anything which has the potential for risk in our society. And we know that alcohol can be an issue for people, but to try and remove it and denormalise it in a way which suggests that it can't be enjoyed sensibly, I think is a shame. And ultimately, I think if we do go down that route, we would be the worse off for it. I think working here in the city and seeing people working sometimes long hours, sometimes quite demanding jobs, to be honest, the best part of the day is seeing some of those same people in some of our great pubs around here. I mean, I work just very, very close to the Barbican, and there's some brilliant pubs in the area. And being able to relax there after work with colleagues, to be able to have that chat and conversation, which you don't get to have at work, and to be able to talk about other things, is a really important part of the day. And I think something that's really, really important. I think it's fair to say I'm a pretty big fan of beer and pubs, and I think hopefully some of you are as well. Now, some might be thinking it's all very well to talk about the good side of drinking and socialising, but what about the negatives? And I certainly wouldn't want to understate the fact that there are certainly harms associated with alcohol, but I think what's really crucial as part of this whole debate is to try and separate out, as I said at the beginning, consumption and harms. It is perfectly possible to enjoy alcohol sensibly. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be very, very clear that those harms exist and we should be tackling them. I think as part of the debates we have, that's quite a clear distinction to draw. And of course, alcohol harm is in no one's best interests, least of all the alcohol industry. And that is something that we say, and sometimes something which people don't believe us on. But I've worked in the industry for about 5 years now, and I can honestly say that everyone I've met is as committed as anyone else to tackling those harms where they occur. And therefore, the decline that we've seen in a range of alcohol harms over the last few years is absolutely something that we should all be pleased about, and something that we should want to see continue, because, as I say, harm is in no one's best interests. And I think brewers and pub companies and pub operators have a fairly strong track record of involvement in quite a lot of initiatives to try and tackle some of those harms which can be associated with alcohol. And that includes initiatives such as the Challenge 21 initiative, which many of you will have seen in pubs, which has been around for quite a long time now, and which has actually led to a pretty big step change in the acceptability of underage drinking. And of course, underage drinking is something which we don't want to see. It's not good for anyone. And other initiatives, including actually making sure that all alcohol has proper information on the label, proper health information on the label, so people can make those decisions for themselves. And including increasing the range of lower strength beers available. That's been a massive surge recently, and something which companies have put quite a lot of investment into and a lot of innovation. I think sometimes cynics might say, well, of course you'd be doing these things. You want to improve your corporate image. You want to make sure that you're not seen as irresponsible companies. And it would be utterly naive to say that that's not part of why companies do these things. But again, having worked in the industry and met many people who work for all of these companies, these are people working there too. The alcohol industry and alcohol companies are often portrayed as this sort of monoliths which don't have any sort of public face, don't have a human face to them. And it's people working there just like you and me, and they don't want to see their children experiencing alcohol harm. They don't want to see that happening to people. They want to make sure that products are enjoyed in the right way. However, I would stress here, I think the key phrase is to encourage people to drink responsibly. And I think that's really important. I think, very sadly, there will always be people who do seek to misuse alcohol and damage their own health and sometimes harm others, and that is obviously deeply regrettable and something we should try and minimise as much as possible. However, I'm not sure that would be completely got rid of, even if alcohol was totally banned. I'm not sure that it's feasible to suggest that we can ever get rid of that entirely, much as we should try. I think treating people like adults is really, really important, and also not demonising those who seek to have a few pints after work and enjoy a drink now and then. I think providing people with that information is the absolute core of the issue, giving people those tools to make those choices. I think, just to touch briefly, the cost of alcohol harm to society is something which is often referenced as a reason for further restrictions on alcohol. And it's absolutely clear that there is a cost in certain situations. However, I'd like to emphasise here again that alcohol is pretty heavily taxed. The beer and pub industry's tax bill already is around 13 billion annually. It's a huge amount of money. I would probably say a bit overtaxed, but that money is there for a reason. That money is there to tackle some of those issues that can be associated with harms. And I think what we should minimise doing is increasing that burden on the sector, which, as I mentioned earlier on, provides a great deal of enjoyment to many, many people, albeit can be misused in certain circumstances. And, of course, as I mentioned as well, the huge contribution to our society and to our economy that the beer and pub industry, which I work for, but the broader alcohol industry brings. And beyond those figures, the social benefit that people do get from drinking, which is something that's very, very hard to quantify, but something that we all know it when we feel it. Why else would people be doing it if they didn't enjoy it? I think the debate gets very polarised sometimes and things can get a bit out of perspective, but I think it should be possible to celebrate the enjoyment of alcohol in our great British pubs and seek to protect it for the vast majority, but target the harms where they occur. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Now, Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's pretty clear that alcohol consumption has fallen. I think the penny has finally dropped on that. It peaked around about 2002 or 2004, depending on what data set you use. But it's fallen by about 20% in terms of per capita alcohol consumption, which means that throughout the entire last 11 years or so of hysteria about binge drinking and alcohol in this country, the consumption has been going down. And I hope some of you, if not all of you, remember what has probably been the greatest moral panic of my life that I can remember, about 24-hour drinking, and how that was going to lead to bedlam and all sorts of carnage in the street and so on. And the reality has been, of course, that, as I say, binge drinking's gone down, alcohol consumption's gone down, drinking amongst young people in particular has gone down, violent crime has gone down, and loads of pubs have gone out of business. That's been the reality of what's happened since then. The drop in consumption amongst young people has been particularly sharp, and I don't know whether that is a permanent trend or just a temporary generational shift, but it's undoubtedly true. Young people, 16 to 24-year-olds, are more likely to be teetotalers than pensioners. And I know sometimes people bring in the Muslim, the increase in the Muslim population. That's probably had some effect on the margins. It couldn't possibly have as big an effect that would be needed to be responsible for more than a fraction of that change. So something clearly has happened. If I had to guess, I would suggest that probably this decline will continue, and we probably won't go back to the levels of 2004, probably for many decades, if ever. The various explanations people give for why young people in particular are drinking less. Possibly it's been the education, possibly it's been the job market, the state of the economy, and so on, temporary things like that. I'm inclined to think that technology has got a lot to do with it. The Facebook and the Twitter and the social media means that people don't need to actually meet each other to socialize. And the decline in drinking mirrors similar declines in other criteria, which I would associate basically with having a good time. I mean, it's not just alcohol consumption's fallen, smoking rates have fallen by more than half, drug use has fallen by more than half, teen pregnancies have fallen by more than half, syphilis probably has fallen, all sorts of things that you might associate with the 20th century partying have gone out of fashion, and that's perfectly fine. And people like me might think it's kind of sad that young people aren't going out drinking, going to the pub as much as they used to, but that's what middle-aged people like me are supposed to think. In a way, they're rebelling against me, just in a way that I consider to be quite lame, but that's fine. At the end of the day, it's down to them. And it's a good, in a way, it's a good thing for me, because as long as there isn't so much of a panic about young people, it means that the temperance lobby and the public health lobby have one less stick with which to beat us. It's more difficult for them to push for legislation against alcohol when there clearly hasn't been this increase in drink-related crime. So if people don't want to get drunk, whatever age they are, people don't want to drink, that's entirely up to them. My only concern is that actually they may not be pursuing their preferences. They may actually have the preference for going to the pub and drinking, but legislation and regulation has made that increasingly difficult. And if 10 years ago the political parties got together and said we want to destroy pubs in this country, then they couldn't have done a lot different to what they've actually done over the course of the last 10 years. The smoking ban obviously was the big thing, but you've had the alcohol duty escalator, you've got various police basically forcing people to breathalyze their customers before they go into pubs and clubs. These days you've had a VAT rise. Next up, you've got a whole lot of nonsense from the Campaign for Real Ale, which will close more pubs. You've got the living wage, which is going to be a serious problem for pubs. The pub sector in general is under serious assault and has been for some time. And I think that the attraction of pubs to young people has declined as a result of legislation, not necessarily as a result of just some change in history that we might as well just accept, pubs are kind of on the wane and that's the way it is. I don't accept that entirely. I think that actually there's a lot of things that government could undo which would help the nighttime economy. So is it something to be celebrated? Only if it's what people actually want to do. I think if they're being pushed away from drink by tax and regulation, no, it's not something to be celebrated. And finally, I would just say that I say in a way it's a good thing that there's a decline in per capita consumption. The public health lobby, quite wrongly, in my opinion, judge the success of their policies based on whether per capita consumption is going down. And they just assume that all harms will fall in proportion to the decline in consumption. But it certainly is the case that alcohol policy is probably one of the few areas of public health policy where things are not getting worse, from my point of view. They're getting, the anti-smoking mob are, running riots. Doesn't seem to be any stopping them. The anti-cigarette, e-cigarette people are doing pretty well. The whole hysteria about sugar seems to be taking off beyond belief. But the alcohol people are not getting very far. They've pretty much been kicked out of government after abusing various ministers. They've walked out of talking to the EU because they think the EU is too pro-alcohol. And the fact that consumption's gone down and associated harms seem to have gone down, it has really taken the wind out of their sails. So that's quite a good thing. But they do just keep switching from one thing to another. At the moment, they're very keen on clamping down on licensing, getting local councils to close down pubs at the drop of the hat. Obviously, the supermarket beer issue and bringing in minimum pricing. Looks like the European Court of Justice is probably going to say that's illegal, which would be great. But they will keep switching from one thing to another. They'll always find something else to look at. Advertising is another avenue. So it's not going away. And things will certainly get worse if alcohol consumption suddenly starts rising again, which it may do. But we should be thankful, in a sense, that young people are doing their bit by drinking less, because it does make it that bit more difficult to generate a moral panic about it.
Okay, thanks. Lots there to think about. Claire.
Christopher, I'd love to be in a debate about sugar, but this isn't about sugar. We could tangentially do it because, of course, alcohol contains sugar, but I don't think this audience come to discuss that. And before I start, syphilis rates are increasing again, as is teen pregnancy. So what goes up also goes down and vice versa. Do you know, I would be out of a job if it wasn't for alcohol. I'm a GP. Probably 25% of what I see in my consulting room is in one way or another related to alcohol consumption, be that the results of fights or injuries, or, as many of you know, the rise in hypertension, breast cancer, all sorts of heart disease, etc., etc., etc. So I'm really pleased, really, really pleased we have alcohol. The other thing is, I did a night ride over London. I don't know if any of you have done that. It starts at 11 p.m. at night and ends at 11 a.m. And you cycle across London. I had never, and I must be naive, I've lived in London 35 years, I had never realised how alcohol plays in the nightlife of London, right up till 11 a.m. in the morning. Pubs and clubs spilling out with people. I'm not saying it was a bad or a good thing, but I really was unaware of the influence that alcohol had. Now, the title of this session is End of Boozy Britain. And as we've heard, Boozy Britain is ending. We've heard that the per capita quantity of alcohol is dropping. But before you jump up and down with glee, it's dropped, and I'm sure Christopher will correct me, but my figures say 4% since 2011, but we're still around about 20% higher than we were at the start of the century. So it's not dropped that much. And whilst drinking has reduced in some groups, and yes, the moral panic around the young ones and binge drinking upset me a lot because I felt they were unfairly targeted, but we know that drinking is amongst my generation, me, probably all of those on this table are drinking at levels far higher than we used to, and certainly far higher than our parents would have drunk. And we've also seen a massive shift, as we've heard, from pub culture to our home culture. So rather than me vomiting in the street and being visible, I don't necessarily vomit in my home, but you get the point. We've become a sort of private group of alcoholics, all of us pretending we really are drinking at safe limits, but actually secretly realising that we're all dependent. But we know that alcohol certainly causes problems, and Sian will talk about that. And alcohol problems, like many of the health problems, and again, I don't fully understand why, are not randomly distributed in the population. even though the likes of me, the middle class, are drinking more, we see problems associated with alcohol much more prevalent in those of lower socioeconomic groups. And whether that is the cheap cider that never quite hits the pub, or the discounted vodka, or the extra strong lager, I don't know. But we do know the more deprived you are, the poorer you are, the more likely you are to suffer from alcohol-related problems. Now, whatever the dynamics, should we expect our nanny state to do something about it? Now, many moons ago, I had an interesting job. I was senior policy advisor at the Department of Health. This was back in the late 90s. And I was told that we were going to have an alcohol strategy. And I was job sharing at the time, and my job share said, this country will never have an alcohol strategy to the day you die. In fact, we've never had an alcohol strategy, basically because it's too unpalatable. It goes across too many departments in our government departments to actually anybody to be brave enough to have a strategy. But should we have one? Should we, for example, have minimum pricing? And please forgive my pun, but I think that's been left to wither on the vine. We currently have the voluntary code. Isn't that we've heard? But isn't that turkeys voting for Christmas? So instead of an alcohol strategy, we have a public health responsibility deal where the industry has pledged to reduce per capita consumption of alcohol. And we certainly have. And please note these figures, my figures that I've picked up, they're probably wrong, but hey-ho. That we've cut 250 million units of drinking between 2012 to 2013. That's a lot, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen? It's a lot. But that is against a background of 50 billion units per year that we all drink. So again, it's a drop in that beer vat ocean. And reminiscent of the tobacco industry, and those of a certain age will remember the advert, it tried to persuade us from smoking Benson and Hedges to Silk Cut. Do you remember those? Safer, better, till somebody pointed out that it was a bit like, instead of jumping from the 16th floor of a high-rise flat, it was jumping from the 13th floor of a high-rise block. So are we actually just all being deluded by this responsibility deal? We've also heard about the cut in units, and again, these are the figures that I've managed to pick up. The industry has reduced some lager strengths from, wait for it, 5% to 4.8%, so 0.2% drop. I think we need to think seriously about what we want to do. I do agree that we went through a moral panic, but you could also hypothesize that the reason we've seen a drop in alcohol and alcohol-related harm is actually because we've had some public sector interventions around alcohol. Or it could be that the reason we're seeing less drinking, less harm, less alcohol-related problems is because of GPs, that general practitioners have actually, through their work in the consulting room, as I do day in, day out, actually reduced people's drinking-related problems, and actually we've made a positive contribution. So thank you very much, and meet me for a drink after this session.
Great, thank you, Claire. And Sian.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, it's a great question. Is this the end of Boozy Britain? I find it very hard to give a straight answer, though, because it really does depend on your perspective, and we've heard many different perspectives from the panel already. It just depends on where you sit. And I've sat in sort of many seats. So for the last 15 years, I've grappled with this issue, first as a journalist, then as a government health official, and now as advisor to the food and drink industry. And I really remember those scenes from Fanaraki and the moral panic that was whipped up at the time. I was covering the story for breakfast television, and I remember day after day the pictures flashed up on the screen of, boozy holidaymakers falling about drunk, and there was an outcry. Something must be done. This is a disgrace, and something was done. And in fact, I had quite a large role to play in that at the time. In the early 2000s, I was head of public health campaigning at the Department of Health. And actually, with ministers, we agonised over the best approach to take to tackle some of the problems around harmful and hazardous drinking. And I also had to sift through all the data around the impact of alcohol on long-term health and the cost to the NHS and to the economy as a whole, to society as a whole. And now I'm working for one of the biggest retailers in Britain, and we're working in partnership with the government to encourage responsible drinking. And, I think it's been a really sensible approach, and I do actually think it's working, and we can see that in the data. But what I have learned over that period of time is that it is an incredibly polarised issue, as we've picked up tonight, and it's very, very complex. I think tackling harmful drinking is like walking a tightrope to try and find the right balance. If doctors and public health officials, shout too much about it, they're accused of hysteria. If government intervenes and sort of steps up, then it's accused of nannying. But then if it doesn't do enough, it's accused of letting industry off the hook. And all the time you've got your media on your back. So it just feels like you can't win. But that said, as we've heard, that there are really encouraging signs that society, I guess, is drinking more responsibly. We agree about the figures. It's down, particularly among young people. And I think strikingly that there's been a 40% increase in the number of young people who don't drink at all. And as we've heard, that partly it's for religious reasons, but there have been lots of interventions, the police, the proper enforcement of underage drinking laws. The last government invested very heavily in education in schools, but I actually think that the biggest factor has actually been the slowdown in the economy, because what's happened is what minimum union price wasn't able to do, which is to significantly put up the price of alcohol, and young people just can't afford it, and they're also having to work really hard at the early starts of their career, which is, I don't think, what I had to do when I first started out. But that said, really good news, there is a huge range of other problems. We know that there are increasing numbers of hard-to-reach, hardcore street drinkers. Hospital admissions have actually doubled over the decade in that same period of time. And the figures, as we know, also show that middle-aged, middle-class people are drinking more and at home. So, maybe we've seen the problems move from Faliraki streets to the sitting rooms of Surrey and London. And I'll put my hand up there and say I really do enjoy a drink, particularly at the end of a really tough day, by juggling kids, chores, running a business. It feels properly exhausting. But, there's no silver bullet to tackling some of the harms around alcohol, and it does take a whole societal response. And I think what we've seen over the last decade is public bodies, communities, employers, the industry, all working in partnership together. And I think that whatever said, we have actually struck the right balance between personal choice and between societal responsibility. But I agree that the important thing when you're tackling tough issues like this is to try and keep a sense of perspective. And as I was reading around the subject over the last week, I saw a report actually and a quote about a big social event. And it said, "Order went out of the window and they compelled everyone to drink huge quantities of wine. It was customary to roam the streets in drunken gangs." Now, this wasn't a report from last summer's 18 to 30s holiday. This was actually written by Plato 2,000 years ago. It comes from his Symposium. So I think that this question about kind of booze is really almost as old as human history itself. And scientists have now proven, although I'm sure we'll debate that too, that it is in fact in our DNA a preference to alcohol. So I wouldn't go as far as to say that we are now at the end of Boozy Britain, but I would say that there are encouraging signs that we are drinking more responsibly as a society.
Fantastic, thank you. And Neil, please.
Okay, so the question, end of Boozy Britain, I'm going to say yes, it is. It is coming to the end, and I'll explain why in a minute. The other thing I actually want to do is to try to explain some of the more sociological reasons why young people are drinking less. And I also want to argue why that's actually a bad thing, and why the fact that young people are drinking less is actually harmful to them. And it's actually harmful to them in their sort of social sense, rather than the sort of their state of their livers, first of all. So some of the speakers have already said, 50 pubs a week are closing. About a quarter of young people are proudly teetotal. And so there has undoubtedly been a cultural shift over the last sort of 15 years where young people are moving away from booze altogether and moving away from boozing and clubbing. And I think just to sort of qualify what I mean when I say it's the end of Boozy Britain, I think we should actually talk about public drinking, because that's what we are really talking about. When we talk about the end of Boozy Britain, we're not talking in a sort of measurement way how much people drink, but the actual culture and what surrounds that in terms of what it meant in Britain. And for me, it meant the corner pub, the local corner pub, or the grand city centre drinking den. All those kind of things played a huge role in British people's lives right across the social spectrum. Now, we were a nation of public socialising drinkers, and actually proud of it as well. And I think all that reflected the fact that Britain once had a healthy civic culture of trade unions, political parties, pressure groups, associations and institutions, as well as all the other social occasions that go with drinking. So I think the demise of public drinking has actually gone hand in hand with a terrible decline of a once vibrant civic culture. So what has actually caused this shift? And is it problematic? And I think it is problematic on a social sense, and it's problematic for how young people are kind of turning out. As some of the panellists have already said, the political authorities have been keen to sort of engineer a change in cultural attitudes towards alcohol and public drinking. Endless official price hikes and VAT for alcohol served in pubs, demands that publicans pay ludicrous amounts of money to put on live music, as the Labour Party did in the early 2000s. The implementation, of course, of the smoking ban in 2007. And in more recent years, local authorities in London to Glasgow have constantly put pressure on publicans to hire profit-crippling security, to inform the police whether someone is consuming drugs or had their phone stolen. So public drinking, I think, has been recast from a pleasant, vibrant and life-affirming space for adults to automatically mean a crime scene waiting to happen, complete with security devices to rival Heathrow Airport. And I think the high expense of public drinking has certainly alienated younger people from embarking on drinking in pubs and clubs. But I think more importantly, the engineering of social attitudes towards alcohol has been very successful for the authorities for a number of reasons. Everything associated with alcohol is framed within a drink-aware narrative and a sort of harm prevention narrative, that alcohol is not a route to pleasure and happiness, but one paved with endless dangers and risks. And I think these changes have coincided and thus reinforced perhaps broader social changes in how young people are socialised in Britain. There has been what I would call a therapeutic turn within the education system that encourages young people not to embrace the characteristics once associated with adulthood. It encourages to see themselves as easily offended and to see others as potentially as toxic as a full bottle of vodka. Young people have sort of always found those steps into public drinking awkward. But I think previously adult society, which is when adult society used to be more worldly wise than it is now, sort of encouraged young people to become more confident and outgoing individuals. And I think the pubs in local communities always played that important socialising role of kind of bringing in young people into the adult world. Whereas I think now, the cultural narrative is almost to sort of persuade them to embrace being a sort of nervy adolescent for the rest of their lives. And I think this was backed up by a study from Plymouth University 2 years ago, which said that university students felt intimidated by drinking in local pubs and felt the authorities should actually do more to protect them from rough-looking individuals. I think being able to actually handle yourself in a potentially aggravating situation was always a marker of adulthood. And now I think young people seek protection as if they were primary school children. Now, we can't underestimate how much young people are cut off from the very idea of pubs and public drinking. and all the evidence bears that out. And I think another reason why that's problematic is that more broadly, these cultural changes, they embrace a very immature approach to handling alcohol, such as drinking in parks or around each other's houses. And I think young people in this instance are actually devoid from a grown-up framework and reference points on how to drink booze and behave in public. So I think, ironically, the war on pubs has actually made the issue of young people and alcohol more problematic than if there was a healthy public drinking culture. I mean, some of the panellists have alluded to, people drinking more at home. I think that's true. But that's only as a consequence of the war on public drinking. Now, some commentators have argued that the growth of microbreweries and micropubs, the rise of gastropubs, suggests that is all that not all is lost. But I think that new generation of bearded hipsters, this idea that they will rescue public drinking, I'm not so sure. I think that's a reflection that public drinking has become a niche activity for a minority in British society. So I think the era of boozy public Britain, of a vibrant civic culture, where adults could be adults and was embraced by all social classes. And that was, once a rich part of the traditions of British society, is sadly kind of disappearing. And unfortunately, I think that's going to be harmful for the social development of young people.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil. I'm going to ask a few questions of the panelists, and I'm going to come back to you guys. So get ready with questions and points. Firstly, Chris, you make a lot of points about some of the moral panics and the concerns and the way politically the arguments have been presented. But surely there's a case about public health with people, if GPs, 25% of their customers are to do with alcohol and with abuse of some kind, or if it's having a big impact on the infrastructure and that type of thing, surely some of these campaigns are important. And what's the balance that should be struck between the two, between the idea of personal responsibility in your view and the idea of a health campaign that presents a discussion on alcohol?
Well, I can't take Clare's 25% as being statistically significant for the whole country. I mean, actually, there's quite a lot of evidence that people who drink do not use the healthcare system more than people who don't drink at all. And as has already been pointed out, drinkers do pay an enormous amount of tax, some £14 billion, I think. So the externalities to do with drinking have been covered several times over, in fact. I recently estimated that the total negative externalities, the absolute maximum that the government could be paying out for both healthcare and public order, is less than £4 billion. And I really do think that is the top end of what it could reasonably be. I think on the issue of public health, people in public health are always trying to portray alcohol as a public health issue, first and foremost. They want the Department of Health to deal with it rather than the Home Office and so on. The problem is, I don't think people actually do. I think people's concerns about alcohol are entirely about public order. And I think quite understandably, I think the direct externalities and the dangers for other people are clear to see. People do not want people urinating around the back of the house, smashing a window, starting fights with them. That is the real concern that people have with alcohol, not the long-term health effects that people might get from drinking. I don't think people probably believe the guidelines on alcohol. They are so low. Anybody who drinks can kind of sense that you can drink quite a bit more than that. But even if people are putting their long-term health at risk, I think people probably think, well, that's really their problem. Whereas our problem is people being threatening in the streets and so on. So that's why the Home Office looks after it. That's why most of the moral panic about alcohol tends to be about young drunk people out in the street, starting fights. And I don't think, and I hope, it will never be seen primarily as a public health problem. I think it's always been primarily a public order problem.
Okay, Clare, you made a couple of quite interesting points. One, you said that yes, you kind of see that it's towards the end of Boozy Britain, but before we jump up and down with glee, we should think about certain things like perhaps secretly lots of people are all dependent. Maybe they're vomiting at home rather than in the street, and maybe they were throwaway remarks. But I did want to ask you, in terms of some of the points that Neil and Daisy were putting forward about like the cultural backdrop of alcohol for the last 2,000 years in society and in the last 50 in Britain, be it, births, marriages, celebrations, how it was often discussed in the past, and now today some of that language does seem to be quite prevalent. To what extent do you think that culturally it should be upheld as an interesting thing for adults to be able to engage with, and it's only a small proportion that's really out of control? Or do you think that generally everyone's got a problem with alcohol, a bit like the Dylan Thomas moment, they call alcoholics people we don't like who drink as much as us?
Or as much as their doctor. I don't have a problem with alcohol. I enjoy alcohol, and certainly since Adam and Eve picked up that apple, we've had alcohol. But, things change. It wasn't that long ago, certainly in my lifetime, when you had a drink for the road. Do you remember that? And now it'd be abhorrent to even have a single drink and drive. So cultures change. And what I think the moral panic is now is the reverse panic. It's saying because alcohol consumption is dropping, because pubs are closing, because people are doing different things like maybe doing pub quizzes rather than, drinking vast amounts, somehow that must be a bad thing. And I don't think it is. I think it's just a thing. It's just what's happening. With respect to people who drink heavily, who don't make access, I think it's not the obvious causes of alcohol-related disease. We often think of liver cirrhosis as it, but I wonder how many of you realise that probably the increase in breast cancer, the excess that we're now seeing, is more than likely due to alcohol. That hypertension, in particular hypertension in men, and if you've got gastritis and hypertension, the likelihood is that's alcohol related. So all of these things that do come in my consulting room. And finally, as I said, I don't have a problem with alcohol, and I'm really pleased that we're putting it squarely where it is, which is where I think it is. The problem drinkers now are the secret drinkers. They're the 50 plus, the 60, 70, and even 80-year-olds who are drinking, who are falling, who are having accidents in the home, and who have the problems that are located in the home that do go into the A&E. And sorry, finally, I want to say about alcohol units. I fully and utterly and totally agree with you about the units. I think we need to scrap those units. I think they were made up on the back of an envelope. I think they have no basis whatsoever in science or in evidence. And I think what they do is they make this whole thing a sort of nonsense and a mess.
Okay, well, I want to ask you, because you were saying that we should be, we should be encouraged by a lot of this good news, and we should encourage responsible drinking in discussions about policy and advising for policy, and also potentially for the industry. To the question that Neil posed about responsibility, like growing up, making choices, experimenting with alcohol and other things, and seeing where your limits are, and your own personal responsibility, making decisions, dealing with the consequences if they go wrong, and that type of thing. Should that now be pushed away a bit more? Should it be a bit more a centralised notion of how we should conduct ourselves and behave? A bit like you should have these amount of units, you should exercise this amount. There's all this advice, banning smoking in some areas, banning drinking in some places. What's the balance in your view? The idea of responsibility is always pushed around, but what does it actually mean?
Well, actually, first of all, on the point about units, they're going to be further reduced downwards, actually, pretty soon.
So soon can't eat a wine gum.
But in terms of, where I sit, I suppose, in terms of kind of young people and, how they should drink and how do you teach them to drink. I mean, I kind of agree with the point that, pubs, were a good place where people could go and learn. There would be adults around and they could kind of, learn to do that. But, culture's changing. It's not just about drinking. It is about, being more connected online. People are living their lives in different ways. And my personal view is that we have to ensure that, or government has to ensure that people have the information they need to make informed choices. And what we've seen over the last 10 years is with public health campaigns is that we've tried to do that not in a nannying way, not wagging the finger at people, but just making sure that we are communicating with different groups, different targeted groups in an appropriate way, rather than just sort of standing there from on high, because people then begin to screen it out. And even Drink Aware actually have done quite a lot of really good work around this. And I was talking to them the other day, and it turns out that where people have landed on the website to actually inquire about kind of calories and how many calories there are in a glass of wine, for example, that information is stickier with people than information about, liver disease. It doesn't seem to be of interest as much.
But it wasn't that long ago we used to have a society where people thought you have provision in the health service. If you get ill or something happens, you get treated. They didn't ask you if you smoked. They didn't say how much did you exercise. It was just treated and people did the things they did. Now we have an ageing population, people living longer than ever before. In the West, generally healthier than ever before. And yet there's this discussion. Sometimes people say, oh, it's because we've intervened like this. But generally, we know that's not the case for the ageing population and all of that. To what extent about where does personal responsibility fall and how much should people be nudged and pushed? You know, where do you really see that?
I think the thing is we're learning so much more about public health and the impact of smoking, drinking, and particular behaviours on our health and on our long-term health. And I think what we've seen over the last 10 years is just a real explosion of that evidence and that information. In terms of kind of people taking responsibility, I mean, everybody will have a different view. As I say, it depends on your perspective. But I think that around alcohol, actually, we've got to a pretty good place.
Okay, I'm going to come out to you in just a second. So can you start indicating if you've got points or questions?
Thank you for your speeches. I'm just wondering, I don't have any data, but you said that the number of pubs is going down, but it seems to me like the number of coffee shops is going up. Is it possible that they're replacing alcohol with coffee? And would that be culturally scary? Would that be a worry for you that they're replacing alcohol with coffee?
I recently saw a Wetherspoons billboard. Maybe someone who works in the alcohol industry would actually remember exactly what it said. It says something to the effect of, defeat isolation, join our congregation in the pub. Namely, the message being, don't be lonely, come here, spend a nominal fee, and you can feel like you have friends. You say that drinking less alcohol or not drinking makes us immature. I'd argue it's your generation that's been immature, relying on alcohol over drinking. We're just reacting against that.
Yeah.
Hi, I just got a bit upset on Thursday. I went out to listen to music down the road from here in Brick Lane, and there were 2 venues doing free music, and they were pretty well empty. And I just thought, just following on from responsible drinking, but also if I was 20, I would have wanted to go to free music or a free night out. It was just an observation anyway.
Hey, yeah, I was just wondering, you're saying quite a lot that drinking in young people has kind of gone down. But as a student, I thought it quite interesting as when we first come to university, everything in our culture is to do with drinking. Our freshers' weeks, our socials with our sports groups or our humanity groups. We have drinking games. This is how we make friends at university primarily. We're not drinking on the streets anymore because we're now pre-drinking at home because it's more expensive. I can get a bottle of vodka for $5.99 and I will drink that I will drink that, and it's still an excessive amount of alcohol. I still think it is a very big issue for young people, and I think it will end up in a lot of alcohol dependence in my generation.
Yeah, I was really interested to learn about this decline in young people going to the pub, because young people drinking because they didn't know about it. About the pub culture, and I get your points about the socialisation, the civic, blah, 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 all that. Yeah, I really get it. But there's another thing that's always troubled me in London particularly, people working in offices, kind of dreary, boring days. At the end of the day, you're going to the pub, getting a little bit, having a few drinks, just kind of dumbing yourself down. I've always seen people do in this city. Drink at night, dumb yourself down, get the last tube home, go to work, just kind of live on a treadmill like that. So this idea that young people are burning the pub and drinking less, and that means they're using their minds more, because as everyone knows, if you're not drinking, you've got a load more time to fill.
The last speaker implied I think you said we've reached quite a good place, as though we've reached some point of stability. But it isn't a stable position. The number of pubs is going down. As I think somebody said, 50 pubs a week. And somebody else has just mentioned, I think, the midweek social culture is, in many towns, pretty dead. So I'd be quite interested, are we really in a good place? If so, I assume you'd want the trend to carry on going down. I'd be interested who on the panel thinks we'd like to see more drinking during the week, more pubs opening. Would that actually be a good thing? Because I think the panel hasn't really addressed Neil's point about the loss of a vibrant civic social life, which I do think was associated with that kind of vibrant midweek pub culture. So I'd be really interested, who actually thinks the number of pubs should be going up, not down?
Okay, and I'm going to add a question to it. I was just at Burning Man in the west coast of America, and when you buy a ticket to attend Burning Man Festival, you basically sign and you say and they say you could die here, and basically you bend it, you mend it. And what was interesting was there wasn't lots of advisors about how we should do this thing or that thing or engage with one another, health and safety. It's just very different to being in Britain. But there was a sense you were responsible for your own conduct and your activity. And to what extent should that be within it, or are these points, and feel free to take any of them, not all of them, but we're using our minds more now because we're not killing them in the bar and that type of thing. I want to start on this side over with you, Neil, please.
That's quite an interesting observation to make, and I don't want to come across like I'm just fetishising alcohol for the sake of it, because as I said in my introduction, I think there's nothing. For me, there's nothing more sort of dead, really, than just sort of drinking at home. You go out to drink, not because of alcohol per se. It's the social experience. It just sort of lubricates, conversation, and it lubricates social experience. And that's not necessarily about hiding behind alcohol, but that's what alcohol does. It provides that relaxation that enables people to sort of get along. And rather than you're not using your brain, in actual fact, it's the opposite. For me, what pubs are ultimately about is conversation, and it's about conversations with your friends. It could be over mindless things, but a lot of the times, historically, it was always over important things. It was over politics. It was over discussions over what's going on in broader society. You'd also sort of stand and fall on your sharp-wittedness as well, and your ability to be a good conversationalist. And we've all been young, and we've all sort of experienced that slight trepidation of having to stand or fall in a pub on the quality of your conversation, and that takes many years to sort of start to get right, and that's the role that pubs have played historically. And I think by contrast, if you look at Facebook and social media, it's completely unhinged, isn't it? Right, when people get into debates on Facebook, it's often unhinged. It's often unmediated because it's not in that social setting whereby you'd think a little bit more carefully about what you're going to say. So I think it's the opposite. I think pubs is about using your mind because it's about discussion. It's about sharpening your social skills and all the rest of it. I'm sorry, social media is not comparable. And it's also a little bit unhinged. So
Okay.
Perhaps I'm just being old-fashioned, but I think the social aspect of pubs is about sharpness, not dullness.
Thank you. Daisy?
I'll pick up on the question from the gentleman at the top about the number of pubs. I think it's an interesting one. I mean, I think the figures we have show it's quite a few less closures than that now, which I think is quite good news. Should there be more pubs? Should pubs be increasing? I think it's very difficult because there has been quite a lot of cultural changes, meaning people don't necessarily go to the pub as much. There is more drinking at home. I think what would be sad is if the number of pubs continue to decline because of the pressures on them and because of some of the pressures around cost pressures around going out or the pressures on pubs to actually be able to operate. I think that would be sad if that's what's causing pubs to close. I think pick up on some of what Chris said earlier. If it is a genuine choice that people don't want to be going to pubs, don't want to be drinking that much, then that is, of course, people's choice. I mean, that's if they want to go to a coffee shop instead, then that's fine. But I would also reiterate that pubs are much more diverse than they ever have been. And we've mentioned some of the pressures that have been placed on them through the smoking ban and through many of the interventions from government, which have undoubtedly caused severe pressure on the pub sector. But it has also brought about quite a big change in the way pubs are and led pubs to have to innovate and have to change, become more food-focused, become more family-focused, provide more of a diverse offer. So I think rather than focus on the fact that pubs are only about alcohol, let's look at the diversity that the pub sector offers, and let's actually say if you want to go to a pub for a coffee, then that's fine as well. But they're much more diverse than they ever have been.
Can I ask you a question as well? Because you're part of a trade association, but it seems to me that the drinks industry are actually very nervous about the whole conversation and discussion, and often are promoting the whole idea of responsibility. Really, it's almost like they feel like, it seems to me, that they're in the firing line. Why would it be the case that one could not just proclaim, go out, do what you want, have fun, don't hurt anyone, and we have laws already to prevent things when they go wrong?
Good question. I think I mean, yeah, it's a heavily regulated sector already. I would absolutely agree with that. I think probably the reason that we go beyond that is because, as I alluded to in my introduction, it's people working within all these companies. They recognise some of the issues that can be associated with alcohol misuse out there. I think that probably drives companies to want to go a little bit further. As I said, give people the tools to actually make those choices a bit better. And while I'd just like to mention in defence of the public health responsibility deal, which Claire alluded to, I do think that whilst it might be suggested that that's been a way of industry setting the agenda, from an industry perspective, it's certainly not been the easiest ask. There's been certain things which have been done through that, which have included huge investment in actually making sure there is that health information on labelling and all sorts of different initiatives, which certainly haven't been cheap or easy to do. They felt under pressure to do that, I think, because people do want to help, but I think we need to be careful about whether we're telling people what to do or actually giving them those tools to make the choices themselves.
Okay.
Yeah, on the question, would I like more pubs? I mean, personally, yes. Personally, I think it's tragic when local community pubs close down. I am a big fan of pubs. I think that they're offering essentially a different proposition now than they were 20 years ago because they've been forced to by the government. You can pay more than £5 for a pint in this city in some places, even in the Wetherspoons. This is not very tempting, and I don't think things are going to pick up enormously just because the economy is getting better. So personally, yes, I would like to see more pubs, and I'd like to see an end to the pub closures. But it's just my personal opinion, and clearly there are people here already spoken that don't see the point of pubs. And if that's the way society is going, then I have absolutely no problem with it. But as I've said before, I do feel that the government has forced people out of pubs rather than anything else. And on the point about supermarket alcohol and people drinking at home, you have to remember the original temperance movement 100 years ago, the Anti-Saloon League in America, they were perfectly all right with people drinking at home. It was the pubs they were after because they saw them as dens of sedition, violence, and all the rest of it. The only reason the temperance movement today is going after the supermarkets is because that's where the alcohol's being bought. Wherever the alcohol is being sold, that's what they'll go after. There's nothing bad about people drinking at home. In many ways, it's much safer than drinking in the pub. But they're not going after it for any other reason than the fact that people are still buying alcohol there.
Okay, thank you. Claire?
Yeah, I mean, because as a doctor, I'm struck by all the arguments, and I think it's a complex area. The one area that I'm always get anxious about is in pregnancy, and probably for the reason many of you will be surprised is that I think the real moral panic is what we're now telling pregnant women, which is if you have even one glass of alcohol in your entire 9 months gestation, you will harm your baby. And there is absolutely no evidence for that. So on the one hand, we do have a misuse of information and data and scare tactics. And on the other hand, I think, and not with this panel, but I think sometimes we do under-egg the harm. And so when we've got both going on, it's very, very difficult to know who to trust and what to believe and how we can best guide people. I do agree with yourself about the anti-nudge agenda. I think we have far too much hysteria on every single time you come and see me as a patient. I have to go through the 5 nudges. It's dreadful. Next, I'll probably have to ask you how many times you have sex and give you some safe sex advice. So I think we are, on the one hand, becoming too panicked, but on the other hand, I think we're actually ignoring some of the misinformation that we as doctors are meant to tell you that is based literally on no evidence whatsoever other than probably finger in the air.
Thank you. And Sean?
I've got a couple of points, actually. Well, first of all, challenge to you, Alan. I mean, you were talking about the industry itself. Why aren't you allowed to kind of say, go out, have fun, have a laugh? Well, that's actually what the marketing departments of drinks companies do. That's exactly what they do. So it's not kind of government and public health officials' job to say it's really great fun. It's their job to put a different message. So that's one point. Just picking up the gentleman in the audience who challenged me on the fact that I thought we were in a good place. I think what I meant was that we're in a good place in terms of the approach and the way that we are addressing the issue, which I think is, around, it's much more targeted. The information is, I think, presented in a much more engaging way and less of a finger-wagging way. And I think the interventions are far more evidence-based than they ever were. So I think in terms of tackling the issues, I think we're in a really good place about that. And in terms of the data and the trends, we are talking about the sort of this big dip in consumption, but actually compared to we were in the 90s, we're still much higher. We still consume much higher than we did then. I can see Chris shaking his head.
Gone back to the early 80s is where we are now.
But we're
Same level as the early 80s.
Okay.
Right. But yes, and I also love the point, which I was going to raise, but I sort of scratched out of my presentation, which is that, maybe younger people are in fact rebelling against watching their parents guzzling wine night after night.
I was really struck that a lot of the discussion on the panel at the beginning focused on the health concerns around alcohol, and especially, Chris, you talked about the binge drinking and all the concerns about the 25% of people going to GPs' practices. But there's a much longer standing cultural critique of the sort of drink culture, which came out in the audience questions. There's been a real sort of critique of the way that the British public go on holiday, and that it's all focused around drinking, and they're not really particularly interested in going to see, different cultures and, having an educated holiday. They want to go for a piss up. And there's that cultural sense, and it's what seems to be occurring is that there's a real cultural critique of sociability and a real question of why is it that we socialise around alcohol, and I'm really interested in why is that? And Neil, you mentioned that obviously the erosion of civic culture and this sort of social engineering of the authorities affecting people's attitudes, but the way I see it, the sort of questioning of our sort of sociability, it reflects that there isn't a sort of spontaneous impetus for people to engage in sociability. And the way I've been thinking about it is the fact that it's alcohol is irrelevant. I mean, in other cultures, it might be the shisha pipe or the marijuana or whatever, but it's that impetus towards sociability that seems to be losing. And I'm sure it is connected with our public life, and there's that, if you get along with people at the workplace and you've really enjoyed your day, it seems to be more spontaneous to actually want to go for a drink, where I've been in a lot of workplaces where you really don't want to go for a drink with people after work.
I just wanted to say that, kind of extending upon some of the points that Neil's made, I'm 16, and I would say that for a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds, especially that do drink, we've kind of come to learn to associate drinking purely with getting smashed at your house parties and your kind of public kind of gatherings and things, rather than associating it with healthy debate, healthy socialising and healthy discussion, which you would typically find at pubs. And I can't help but feel like I'm kind of missing out in that respect.
Well, I feel a little bit like the person who, the little boy who cried wolf. I think we've had an admission tonight, which is really quite significant from you two there, quite rightly, that, the alcohol unit thing is a load of rubbish, but you say you're going to bring it down even more. And, of course, we all know, I've been trying to tell my daughters-in-law for some time, I'm amazed that they give up drinking as soon as they get pregnant. In fact, that's the first thing we know before they tell us that they're pregnant, they give up drinking, and that's the sign. And that too. So my point is, how much more money are we going to waste on public health initiatives which are not based on the truth? And can you expect young people or anybody else to take you seriously when you put in these ridiculous limits, which we all know are stupid, and yet you keep on just, coming out with them? I think it's very, very hard for young people, or older people for that matter, and I quite agree that there's a big problem among older people in that sense. I think it's very hard for people to know where they stand when you don't give people the true facts, and in fact an exaggerated fact.
What would you say about the current level of alcohol taxation? Is it too high? Is it too low? Is it about right? And is the effect of taxing alcohol really that it reduces consumption, or does it mainly lead to people substituting lower quality alcoholic drinks?
I got a question for the audience. It's to the point that was raised at the front about coffee shops, and to Neil's point that in response to the fresh minds engaging and sociability, to what extent would you need to have alcohol? Do people think that's a useful, enjoyable thing that's pleasurable and we should do it as part of our culture? And to what extent people think actually just coffee shops or anything else, that's the way to go? I'm interested to hear some more thoughts about how important people think alcohol is part of the cultural mix and everyday life and should be like a pleasurable thing or not.
I think that inebriation is a very important part of society, not just our society with regards to alcohol, but if you look at in Yemen or Somalia when politics and the issues of the day will be discussed in a cat house where people will chew this cat, which relieves you of your inhibitions and you're more open and more free to discussion. I don't think it's something that's dead, though. This pub scene in the UK, I'm from Blackpool, and there's a lot of pubs, there's a lot of local community pubs, working men's clubs, which are still going quite well. Is there a centre of the community, people congregate, so yeah, there's still a spark burning.
I wanted to make a point actually on what you said about whether or not coffee shops can replace pubs, and it kind of leads on to another point I wanted to make and a question I had. I have spent a long time working in pubs, and there's this particular time of the day when men come in when they've finished work, and they use it as a time to kind of wind down and work out, how they're going to go home or kind of get their work day, and also socialise. And I think I learned that it's very important for men to have that social space. If you were to replace that with coffee shops, the way a pub is laid out, it allows an individual to walk into a space because most of it's standing. In a cafe, everybody's sat down, so you're in a group environment. The cafe can never replace this social element of a pub for an individual. And I think the biggest people who suffered in the pubs closing down and it becoming less and less acceptable to go to pubs are actually men. And the kind of mental well-being I think that men drew from having a place where they could go.
We hear an awful lot about the pissing on the streets and the vomiting in people's back gardens and all the rest that comes with pubs and clubs. And as a result, people who operate those small businesses on the whole are very highly regulated, and it's actually a very tough business for a lot of people who go in for that kind of thing. What I want to hear from the panel is when are we going to start hearing a little bit more about the net benefit, the cultural or social benefit of the retailers on the streets, the people supplying alcohol to people who may end up, as an unfortunate consequence, needing a pee or vomiting on a rare occasion, and whether or not that perhaps the tone of the conversation ought to be changed a little to consider the balance between the benefits that these institutions, their establishments offer society versus the occasional nuisance you might experience in a town or a city.
It's just a really short observation about kind of coffee shops versus pubs, and how often if I was to go to Nero or something, it would just be to kind of read my book on my own with a coffee, which is completely different to the usual pub experience, really.
I think because of the internet and because of all these new technologies that I've now been brought up with, people need more alcohol in order to socialise. We are unable to socialise as past generations have. There's a book called The Machine Stops, and in it you can't people don't actually talking face to face with each other. They can't they don't have that contact anymore because they just contact each other through technology. So that's what I think.
Okay, thank you.
Just an observation, alcohol does have a lot of benefits in terms of helping people to communicate with each other, helping people to express love, helping people to be honest and open, and these are all wonderful qualities which people like to engage in when they go and have a heart-to-heart with someone or heart-to-heart with their friends. So on the one hand, I think it is sad that there is a decline in alcohol in this respect, but is it also possible that this decline in alcohol is to do with actual fact more of a focus on emotional intelligence for youngsters and more focus on being able to express themselves and have integrity and things like that? I don't know the answer to that question, but if that is the case, it would be quite exciting if there was a birth of that as opposed to needing alcohol to
Okay, thank you. We're going to go in reverse order. Obviously, there's lots of points and questions. Just to say, I'll say a couple of things at the end, but obviously the idea is that we can carry on having this conversation, argument, discussion. In the bar, you can drink coffee or water or alcohol or all of those things. Sian.
Yeah, just a quick point, really. I mean, it's a shame we haven't got longer to discuss, and we can obviously go to the bar and do that. But it does seem to be opening out into a discussion around sort of socialisation and how we socialise and culture, and actually the impact of online and social networking. And maybe it's not just an issue about alcohol and how we drink. It's much, much bigger than that. And then just in terms of the Chief Medical Officer's reports, I don't introduce the drinking guidelines, but I understand that all the Chief Medical Officers of the United Kingdom are getting together, and it looks like they probably will end up dropping or recommending that they drop the guidelines, but whether ministers will let them is a different matter.
Okay, thank you, Claire.
Thank you. And I've been in this field now for 30 years, and I've shifted, and I am, as a really experienced doctor, even more confused today than I was when I first qualified. I now don't know what it is, what safe drinking is. I actually don't know what the advice is to give my patients other than those that are coming with problems and actually to relate them to possible excess alcohol. I don't know what dependence is or addiction is anymore because I think the vast amounts of people over the age of 50 are dependent on alcohol. Whether they're problem drinkers, I don't know. So I just want to say that as an honest reflection of my life. You asked about public health. I'm even not as confused, and I think the best advice I can give anybody is don't smoke, keep well away from doctors, and wear a seatbelt. And choose your parents.
Okay, thanks, Christopher.
Yeah, I mean, you will never get evidence-based guidelines on alcohol because there is no safe level of drinking and there's no safe level of not drinking. There is a well-known J-curve in alcohol where you have to actually drink quite a bit to assume the same amount of risk as a teetotaler. A lot of that is down to cardiovascular disease, but there is no, it's now quite commonly said that even a small amount of alcohol can increase the risk of breast cancer. I'm not convinced by the evidence of that, but even if it were true, what are you supposed to do? Drink nothing at all if you're a woman and increase your risk of heart disease, or drink a bit and increase your risk of breast cancer. You pay your money and you take your choice. So they'll never get decent guidelines on this. If they drop it, I mean, people will just completely ignore them. I mean, it would just become a laughingstock, so I hope they do that. And on alcohol taxation, we are ripped off in this country so much. I don't think people appreciate it. £2.50 is tax on a bottle of wine, about £8, £9, maybe even more, on a bottle of spirits. And the result of that is not that we drink less, it's that we drink worse stuff. We don't know what good wine is in this country. We really don't. We get sent all the rubbish from the rest of the world because they know that we don't know any better. We have to drink terrible spirits and so on, and it just reduces the social welfare that you associate with drinking.
The way to solve that might be to drink excellent British beer, but just to pick up on the query and the comment from the chap at the front here, I think talking about holidays and going away and whether we have a cultural experience or not, and I've always found that the best way of getting to know a country is to actually go and visit some bars, visit some places and have a drink. And actually, I do go and do the cultural stuff too, but I learn far more about the culture of that country often sitting in a local bar, and I think that's very much true of the UK. I think going to a British pub is massively popular on the list of things to do when you come here, and I think I would absolutely agree that's a great thing to do. In terms of the beer tax point, I have to agree with Chris here. I think unfortunately, as well, the effect of increased taxes is always going to hit pubs harder because they have more fixed costs. And we've talked a lot today about the benefits of drinking in pubs because they're a great place to be. And I'm not saying it should be a choice about you drinking at home is terrible and drinking in pubs is the best thing ever, but there's a lot of additional benefits to going to the pub. And I think taxes are always going to hit those pubs harder and put more pressure on them and lose those spaces that we've talked about today. I think, just to pick up again on the lady at the back there talking about the face-off between coffee shops and pubs, I mean, I think one of the great positives has been in the changing environment of pubs is that actually, personally speaking, as a woman, I'm quite happy to go into a pub on my own these days and just sit and have a pint and read my book. Or to meet friends, and I think
no one else there. As well,
well maybe, but I think as a space to be, I think they're just as good as coffee shops.
On the coffee shop versus pub conundrum, well, definitely pubs are doing it all the time. I mean, if you go to a pub at a peak time, the atmosphere, the vibrancy is just incomparable to a coffee shop, which are all sort of like library-esque. I mean, there's nothing wrong with them, but they're not comparable, and that's because of that role that alcohol plays. I mean, the sort of snide comment to say, well, you can't cope if you can't have a conversation without alcohol. It's not really about that. It's just the social lubricants, and that's how humanity has always used alcohol. So I think it's important in that sense, and rather than just focusing in on units and fights and liver disease and all these sort of grim narrative around alcohol, I still think the important side of it is to always remember the social aspect of it and the pleasure it gives millions of people as a consequence of that. And I think we're just losing sight of that historic role that alcohol and public drinking, which is why I always emphasise public drinking over boozing at home. There's one thing I just want to end on. The young woman here was talking about how amongst young people alcohol is just associated with getting smashed, and a sociologist called Daniel Briggs wrote a very good book 2 years years ago, which is specifically looking at Ibiza and boozing abroad. And what he noted that young people would never, ever go to a pub, and it would be literally downing half a bottle of vodka at home or in their hotel, and then hitting straight to the pub. And he noticed that was the sort of biggest sea change. So, ironically, rather than the sort of Ibiza culture being used as a warning, used as an example as to why public drinking should be tackled, it's actually a consequence. That the way that young people will drink on holiday is actually a consequence of the war on public drinking. So I think that's that you can see where the problems it leads when there's an attack on attempting to bring young people into a more mature way of drinking.
Okay, I'd like to invite you to thank the panel.